The chute wouldn't budge. Wren had her whole shoulder into it, palm flat against the rusted metal door, when something inside scraped back against her fingers. Not wood, not stone. Cloth. Old cloth, stiff with age, wrapped around something with corners. She froze. Wind was cutting sideways through the gaps in the barn siding, carrying the smell of cold hay and diesel and rust, and for a second, the only sound was her own breath and a loose sheet of tin somewhere above her, ticking against a nail. She pulled her hand back out slow, like the chute might bite. 3 weeks earlier, she hadn't even known this barn existed. Wren Calloway was 23 years old, and by the time she stood in that grain chute's shadow, she had exactly $312 to her name, 1 duffel bag, and a car that made a sound over 40 miles an hour she'd decided not to think about too hard. She'd spent the last 4 months sleeping on a friend's couch in Columbus after her mother's cancer took the rent money, then took her mother, in that order, and left Wren holding nothing but a stack of medical bills and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing with collections calls. She hadn't spoken to her father since she was 9. So when the letter came, county seal, lawyer's letterhead, her name spelled right for once, she almost didn't open it. People who'd left you alone for 14 years didn't usually leave you anything good. But what she didn't know yet, standing there reading it twice at her friend's kitchen table, was that the barn her father died owning wasn't just a barn. And she had no way of guessing, not then, that the back taxes on 40 acres of Ohio farmland, land the county had been trying to unload for 3 years, would come to exactly $340, less than her car payment, less than a month of the rent she couldn't make anymore. Have you ever had something handed to you that looked like nothing and felt, somehow, like it might be everything? That's where Wren was, standing in a lawyer's office in a town she'd never heard of, signing papers for a piece of land nobody else wanted, because it was the only door that hadn't already closed on her. If you're new here, welcome. I tell stories like this one most weeks, about people who started with almost nothing and found something they weren't looking for. Stick around for this one. I don't think you'll want to look away. The lawyer, a heavy-set man named Otis Bramwell, who kept a photo of a golden retriever on his desk, angled toward visitors, had warned her before she even sat down. "Now, I want to set your expectations proper," he'd said, sliding a folder across. "That barn's been empty going on 6 years. Roof's got a hole in it you could drop a truck through. I wouldn't be doing my job if I let you drive out there thinking you're inheriting a postcard." "I'm not expecting a postcard," Wren had said. "I'm expecting a place to sleep that isn't somebody's couch." Otis had looked at her a long moment, the kind of look older men gave her sometimes, not pity exactly, something closer to recognition. "Your daddy bought that land in 1998, he said. "Ran a few head of cattle on it for a while. Then he'd trailed off." Glanced at the folder, like it might finish the sentence for him. "Well, man had his troubles. I expect you know some of that better than me." She hadn't, actually. Not really. Her mother had never talked about him past the basics. That he'd left, that he'd stopped calling, that some men just weren't built for staying. Wren had built her whole understanding of Colton Calloway out of that silence, and the silence had never once suggested he owned 40 acres and a barn 2 hours south. "There's one more thing," Otis had said, and something in his voice changed register, went careful. "He left a letter, for you. My instructions were to hold on to it till you took possession, not hand it over with the deed." Man was specific about that. Why? Didn't say. Just said you'd understand once you saw the place. She hadn't understood. Not driving down 2-lane highway with harvested cornfields stretching flat and gold stubbled on either side. Not turning down the gravel road marked only by a bent mailbox with Calloway still legible under years of rust. Not when the barn first came into view. Sway-backed roofline, one door hanging by a single hinge, paint gone entirely to grey wood except for a stubborn strip of red under the eaves where the weather hadn't reached. She'd sat in the car a long moment before getting out, The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere off in the tree line, a crow was making a racket about something, and the November air coming through her cracked window smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt, and underneath that, faintly, like livestock that hadn't been there in years. This is it, she'd thought. This is what 14 years of nothing turns into. For a moment, just a moment, she'd wanted to put the car back in reverse. But there was no couch waiting for her back in Columbus. Her friend Priya had been gentle about it, but clear. Her lease didn't allow a second person past 90 days, and those days were about up. There was no apartment Wren could afford on server wages, no family beyond a father she'd never speak to again, and whatever cousins he might have had that nobody had bothered introducing her to. There was this barn, and 40 acres, and $340 already spent. So she'd gotten out of the car. The barn door had shrieked on its one working hinge when she pushed it open, and the inside smelled like dust and old wood and something mineral, like rain-soaked stone. Light came down in blades through the gaps in the roof, cutting the dim interior into stripes. She stood in the doorway a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, taking in the shape of the place. The loft half collapsed at one end, a row of stalls along the near wall gone soft with rot, and at the back, half swallowed in shadow, the tall wooden structure of the old grain elevator, with its chute running down one side like a crooked spine. That was where she found the note. Not the letter Otis had, a different one, tacked with a rusted nail to a support post near the chute, the paper gone brittle and water-stained, but the handwriting still legible in blocky, careful pencil. Don't touch the chute till you talk to Earl Sims, Road 9, Blue House. She'd stood there reading it 3 times, the way you read something that doesn't make sense the first 2. Who was Earl Sims? And why would her father, a man who'd left before she could remember his voice clearly, leave instructions nailed to a wall for a daughter he had no reason to believe would ever come looking? She hadn't touched the chute that day. She'd told herself it was because the light was going, because the temperature was dropping, because she needed to figure out where she was even going to sleep that first night, with no working lock on the door and a stack of homework. That's how she'd started thinking of it. The sheer scale of repair ahead of her, like homework, waiting. But if she was honest with herself, some small stubborn part of her had wanted to wait, had wanted, for one evening at least, to sit with the strangeness of it. A father's handwriting, a stranger's name, a warning nailed up like it mattered, before she went looking for whatever it was he hadn't wanted her to find alone. She slept that first night in her car, parked close to the barn, doors locked, a borrowed sleeping bag pulled up to her chin, and the note's 4 words circling in her head, like something caught on a loop. Talk to Earl Sims. She didn't know yet that Earl Sims lived 1.5 miles down Road 9 in a house the color of a robin's egg, or that he'd known her father for 30 years, or that he'd been half expecting this exact knock on his door since the funeral. She didn't know, either, what her hand would find jammed in that grain chute 3 weeks later, cloth-wrapped, corners hard beneath the fabric, tucked so far back it had taken her that long just to work up the nerve to reach for it. All she knew, that first cold night, with the crows gone quiet and the stars coming out sharp and close the way they never had in the city, was that her father had left her more than a barn. He'd left her a question, and she was going to have to go looking for the answer, whether she was ready or not. Earl Sims turned out to be a broad-shouldered man somewhere north of 70, with a face weathered the color of the barn wood itself, and a way of looking at Wren like he was doing arithmetic behind his eyes. He answered his door in a flannel shirt buttoned wrong by one hole, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand, and for a long moment he just stood there taking her in, the shape of her jaw maybe, or the set of her shoulders, before he said anything at all. "You've got his eyes," he said finally. "Colton's. Same exact color, that grey-green. I'd have known you on the street. You knew my father. 31 years. He stepped back from the door. An invitation. Come on in before you catch your death. Coffee's fresh. His kitchen smelled like wood smoke and burnt toast, and there was a dog, some kind of elderly, grey-muzzled shepherd mix, asleep in a patch of sun near the radiator, who didn't so much as lift his head when Wren came in. Earl poured her a mug without asking if she wanted one, and set it down across a table scarred with decades of use. I found a note, Wren said, before she'd even sat down properly. In the barn, my father's handwriting, far as I can tell, said not to touch the grain chute till I talked to you. Something moved behind Earl's eyes. Not surprise, she thought, more like relief, like a thing he'd been carrying a long time had finally been set down where it belonged. He wrote that note about 4 years back, Earl said, before things got bad with his heart. Made me swear I'd keep an eye on the place after he passed, make sure nobody went into that chute without knowing what they were walking into. He wrapped both hands around his own mug, didn't drink from it. You want to know what's in it? Or you want to know about him first? Because I'll tell you, those two things go together. Can't hand you one without the other. Wren thought about her mother, who'd talked about Colton Calloway maybe a dozen times in her whole life, always in the same flat, closed-off tone, like reciting a fact she'd long since stopped feeling anything about. Your father wasn't built for staying. Your father had his own troubles. Your father did what he did, and I did what I had to. Both, Wren said. Start wherever makes sense. So Earl told her. He told her that Colton Calloway had bought the barn and the 40 acres in '98, with money from a construction job gone right, back when he still had steady hands and a marriage that hadn't yet come apart at the seams. That for a few years it had been a real working piece of land. A dozen head of cattle, a garden Colton's wife kept out back, a life that from the outside looked like it might hold. Then he lost the job, Earl said. Whole crew got let go when the company folded. And your daddy? He wasn't a man who took losing things well. Started drinking bad. I mean bad, not weekend bad. And things at home. He shook his head slow. That wasn't my business to fix, and I didn't try hard enough to help, and that's a thing I've had to live with. But I know it ended with him gone from your life and gone from hers too, near enough, though he never did leave this land. Kept paying what he could on it, even after everything else fell apart. Even after the cattle were sold off, and the barn started going to seed. Man wouldn't let go of this place if it killed him. Which, Earl added quietly, in a manner of speaking, I suppose it did. Heart give out on him going on 8 months back. Found him myself, out past the tree line. Wren sat with that a long moment, turning the coffee mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. Outside, wind was pushing at the windows, and somewhere down the road a dog was barking at something. On and on, monotonous. Why didn't he ever call? She said. It wasn't really a question, not one she expected Earl to answer. 14 years, not a birthday card, nothing. Shame, Earl said simply. I asked him about it once, years back. Told him he ought to reach out, make it right, while he still could. He said, Earl paused, like he was pulling the exact words up from somewhere old. He said he didn't want you to know him like that. Said he'd rather you think he just didn't care than know what kind of man he'd let himself become. Didn't think that was much of a gift, giving you a father who couldn't hold himself together. That's not, Wren's voice caught, and she was surprised by it. Surprised by the sudden heat behind her eyes, for a man she barely remembered the sound of. That's not a decision he got to make for me. No, Earl agreed. It wasn't, and I told him so. But grief makes fools of the living, same as it does anybody, and shame's its own kind of grief. He spent the last several years of his life trying to build something back, sober the whole time, near as I could tell, working that land alone, little by little, wouldn't say what for. I used to tease him, ask if he was building an ark, a small, sad smile. Now I think maybe he was building something else. He stood, finally, crossed to a drawer near the sink, and came back with something small wrapped in a handkerchief, which he set on the table between them without ceremony. "That's the key," he said, "to the lockbox in the chute. He gave it to me the same day he wrote that note. Told me to hold on to it till his kin came looking. Didn't say it'd be his daughter. I don't think he let himself hope that far." Wren unwrapped the handkerchief. Inside was an old brass key, small, the kind that belonged to a strongbox or a trunk, worn smooth at the edges from years in someone's pocket. "There's a chest built into that chute," Earl said. "He rigged it himself, years back. False wall, hidden shelf, whole business. I never asked what was in it. Wasn't my business, and he never offered. But I'll tell you this much." He looked at her steady, the way you'd look at someone you were about to hand something heavy. "Whatever's in there, he spent the better part of 4 years making sure it'd land safe in your hands and nobody else's. That's not nothing, coming from a man who spent the rest of his life feeling like he had nothing left to give you." Wren closed her fingers around the key. It was colder than she expected, and heavier. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "When I open it." Earl was quiet a moment, and something crossed his face that she couldn't quite read. Reluctance, maybe, or something closer to grief holding its breath. "No," he said finally, gently. "I think that's a thing you ought to do alone. But you come back after, whatever's in there, and I'll pour you something stronger than coffee, and we'll figure out together what happens next." Driving back to the barn with the key on the passenger seat beside her, Wren found herself replaying one detail Earl had mentioned almost in passing, that Colton had never remarried, never so much as dated, in 14 years alone on that land, that he'd kept, of all things, a photograph of her from her 5th birthday, tacked up inside a kitchen cabinet nobody but him would ever open. She hadn't asked Earl how he knew about the photograph. She was starting to suspect there was more to Earl Sims's 31 years of knowing her father than a neighbor's casual friendship, and more reasons than grief alone for why he hadn't offered to come along. The chute door groaned open easier than Wren expected, the hinge giving way under gentle pressure once she found the right angle. Earl's rigging, she guessed, built to open smooth for someone who knew where to push. Inside, past the old grain shaft's collapsed remains, was exactly what Earl had described, a false wall of weathered board that swung inward on a hidden pivot, and behind it, a shallow recess just large enough to hold a metal lockbox, and wedged beside it, the cloth-wrapped bundle her fingers had first found 3 weeks before. Her hands were not steady as she lifted them out. The lockbox opened with the brass key on the second try, the mechanism stiff from disuse. Inside, banded in rubber gone brittle with age, were stacks of cash. Not a fortune by movie standards, she'd think later, but more money than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. Beneath the bills, a manila envelope holding property documents, a life insurance policy she hadn't known existed, and a small velvet pouch that, when she opened it, spilled out into her palm a woman's wedding ring, gold gone soft with age, and a man's watch stopped at some hour that meant nothing to her yet. The cloth-wrapped bundle held a leather journal, its cover cracked and soft from handling, and tucked inside the front cover, an envelope with her name on it in the same blocky pencil hand as the note on the post, Wren. She sat down right there on the dusty floor of the barn, back against the old grain elevator, and opened it. "Wren, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say any of it to your face, which is about what I deserve, though I'd hoped for better. I want you to know I thought about calling more times than I can count. Every year on your birthday, mostly. I'd get as far as dialing half the number before I'd lose my nerve. I told myself I was protecting you from the mess I was. Truth is, I think I was protecting myself from having to hear how little you thought of me, and a coward doesn't deserve to call that protection. I'm not going to spend this letter making excuses. You'll find the whole ugly shape of it in these journal pages if you want it, and if you don't owe me the reading. What I want to tell you instead is what this land became to me. Once I stopped drinking and started, slowly, trying to be a man worth being. I bought this place thinking it'd be a fresh start for your mother and me. It wasn't, not the way I hoped, but after everything fell apart, I came back to it anyway, because it was the one thing left that hadn't given up on me. Or maybe it's truer to say, it was the one thing I hadn't yet found a way to ruin. I spent years out here alone, fixing what I could fix. And somewhere in that work I found the version of myself I should have been for you all along. Too late to be your father in any way that counted. Not too late, I hoped, to leave you something. The money isn't the gift, Ren, though I know it looks that way sitting there in that box. Money like that runs out. What I'm hoping you'll take instead is this: 40 acres and a barn that's already survived worse than either of us. A place that asks nothing of you but the willingness to show up and put your hands to work, same as it asked of me. I don't know what kind of woman you grew up to be. I hope, whoever she is, she's stubborn. This place rewards stubborn. There's a man named Earl Sims down the road who knew me better than anyone alive, including, I'd guess, better than I knew myself some years. Trust what he tells you, even the parts that are hard to hear, especially those. I'm sorry I wasn't braver, sooner. Love, in the only way I ever really learned how to give it. Dad Ren read it 3 times before she could set it down. Outside, the light had shifted, gone long and amber the way it did in late afternoon, and somewhere above her in the loft, a bird she couldn't see was moving through old rafters, wings brushing wood. She sat with the letter in her lap and the journal beside it, unopened, and let herself cry the way she hadn't since the week her mother died. Not gently, not the tidy grief of movies, but the kind that came up from somewhere old and unattended and left her hollowed out and, strangely, lighter. When she finally opened the journal, she didn't read it front to back. She let it fall open where the spine was most worn, and found an entry dated almost 2 years back, her father's handwriting steadier there than in his early pages, like a man's hand improving along with the rest of him. Talked to Earl again today about telling her. He thinks I'm waiting too long, that every year I put it off is a year I can't get back. He's not wrong, but I keep thinking, what if I show up in her life now, unsteady as I still sometimes am, and I disappoint her all over again, except this time she has to watch it happen instead of just hearing about it second-hand. I'd rather she remember me as absent than remember me as one more disappointment standing in her kitchen. Maybe that's cowardice dressed up as mercy. Earl thinks so. I'm not sure he's wrong about that either. She flipped further, found an entry mentioning a name that snagged her attention. Not Earl this time, but someone else. M came by again today, asking after the barn's condition. Said her husband's been asking about buying the back 40 for the development out past the county line. Told her the land's not for sale, not while I'm breathing, and she looked at me like she thought that day might come sooner than I'd like. Maybe she's right. Doesn't change my answer. M. Wren turned the phrase over. A neighbor, maybe, or someone from town. And whoever this person's husband was, they'd wanted this land for something called the development, badly enough to keep asking. She made a note to ask Earl. The last thing she found, tucked loose between the final pages, was a photograph. Herself, unmistakably, 5 or 6 years old, gap-toothed, and squinting into sunlight at what looked like a birthday party she had no memory of. On the back, in the same pencil hand, kept this close. Wish I'd kept more than a photo. She sat there a long while as the barn dimmed around her, the amber light going grey, then blue, until she could barely make out the shape of the journal in her lap. She thought about Earl's face when she'd asked him to come with her, that flicker of something withheld, and about the initial M tucked into a journal entry about a development and a husband who wanted her father's land. She had more questions leaving that barn than she'd walked in with. But for the first time since the lawyer's letter had arrived, she also had something else, something she hadn't expected to find in a rusted-out barn on 40 acres of land nobody else had wanted. The outline, faint but real, of a father worth grieving properly. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd go back to Earl's. Coffee first. Then the truth about Earl had coffee waiting again, like he'd known she'd be back before she knocked. "You read it," he said, not a question, taking in her face, the redness still faint around her eyes, the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a night sitting with grief instead of sleeping through it. "I read all of it." She sat across from him at the same scarred table, the dog stirring this time, lifting his grey muzzle long enough to sniff at her hand before settling again. "There's a name in the journal, just an initial, M. Something about a husband wanting to buy the back 40 for a development." My father told her no. She watched Earl's face carefully. "You know who that is?" Earl's jaw worked for a moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone careful in a way she was starting to recognize. The voice of a man weighing how much truth a person could carry at once. "That'd be Marlene Ashby," he said finally. "Her husband Dale runs the biggest outfit in the county, doing what they call rural development. Buys up land cheap, subdivides it, sells lots to folks wanting a piece of country living without the country part. Been after your daddy's 40 acres going on 6 years now. Offered him good money for it, more than once. And he kept saying no. Kept saying no." Earl turned his mug in slow half circles on the table. "Made Dale Ashby plenty sore. I'll tell you that. Man's used to getting what he wants. Your daddy standing in his way, refusing to sell a piece of land half the county figured was worthless anyway. That didn't sit right with him." "Is that dangerous? For me, I mean, now that it's mine." "I wouldn't say dangerous." Earl considered the word like he was testing its weight. "Dale Ashby's not the type to do anything you could call him on outright, but I'd watch myself around Marlene if I were you. She's got a way of being friendly that isn't." Wren would understand what he meant 3 days later, when Marlene Ashby appeared at the barn's open door, unannounced, dressed like she'd stepped out of a real estate brochure, holding a casserole dish, like a peace offering nobody had asked for. "You must be Colton's girl," Marlene said, smile arranged just so. "I heard you'd come to take the place in hand. Isn't that brave of you?" Wren, up to her elbows in the loft's rotted floorboards, wiped her hands on her jeans and did not take the casserole. "I'm just fixing up what's mine." Of course, of course." Marlene's eyes moved past her, taking in the barn's ruin with an expression that didn't bother hiding its assessment. Pity, maybe, or something colder dressed up as pity. "It's a big undertaking, is all I mean. A young woman, alone, out here with no help. I just want you to know, if it ever gets to feeling like too much, and it will, dear, places like this always do, Dale and I would take real good care of this land. More than fair price. You wouldn't have to lift another finger." "I like lifting fingers," Wren said. Something flickered behind Marlene's practiced smile. Not quite anger, something more calculating. "Well, the offer stands. These things have a way of wearing a person down faster than they expect." She set the casserole on a sawhorse near the door, uninvited, and left with a wave that felt more like a warning than a goodbye. Wren stood in the barn's doorway a long time after the car pulled away, turning over the strange, cold shape of the encounter, the studied kindness that hadn't once asked how she was actually doing, that had circled straight back to the land itself, again and again, like a compass that only pointed one direction. She didn't touch the casserole. The rebuilding in the days that followed became its own kind of language, one she was slowly learning to speak. She started with the roof first, the gaping hole Otis had warned her about, and it was there, 3 days into hauling salvage tin up a borrowed ladder, that she met Dwayne Pruitt. He showed up unasked, the way Earl had said folks around here sometimes did, driving a truck older than she was, and hauling a trailer of scrap lumber he claimed he didn't have any use for anyway. "Heard Colton's girl was out here trying to patch that roof solo," he said. by way of introduction, squinting up at her precarious position on the ladder. Figured you could use another set of hands that's done this before. Dwayne was somewhere in his 50s, built solid, with the particular quiet of a man who'd spent his life working with wood and didn't waste words when his hands could do the talking instead. He didn't ask about her father beyond a brief, gruff good man when he was steady, didn't pry, didn't offer opinions on Wren's decision to stay. He just climbed up beside her and started working, and by the time the light went gold and long again, they'd closed the worst of the hole together. "You did construction with my dad," she said, somewhere in the third hour, sweat and rust dust streaked across her forearms. Before things went sideways for him. Dwayne hammered a nail flush without looking up. "I'll tell you something, and then I'll leave it be, because it's not really mine to tell in full. Your daddy spent years feeling like the whole town had written him off. Some of it, I won't lie, was earned. But there's a difference between a man who stays broken and one who does the work of putting himself back together, even slow, even mostly alone. He did the second one. Took him a long while to believe folks around here noticed." "Did they notice?" Dwayne was quiet a moment, considering. "Some of us did. Others." He shrugged, a small, honest gesture. "Others still see the man he was 15 years back and can't seem to update the picture. You'll run into a few of those in town. Don't let it get to you." She would, in fact, run into one of those very soon, a woman named Sherry Voss who ran the hardware store's front counter and greeted Wren's first visit with a thin, assessing look and a comment about how she hoped this one had more staying power than her daddy did, delivered with just enough smile to make it hard to call out directly. Wren had paid for her lumber and left without responding, jaw tight the whole drive home, Dwayne's words about updating the picture circling uselessly against the sting of it. That night, back at the barn, cleaning rust from her hands under the cold trickle of water she'd rigged from a rain barrel, Wren found herself thinking less about Sherry Voss's comment and more about the stopped watch she'd found in the lockbox. The hour it had frozen at, some detail nagging at her that she couldn't yet place. She dug it out of the duffel bag where she'd stashed the lockbox's contents and turned it over in the lamplight. The back panel, she noticed for the first time, was engraved, worn nearly smooth, but there, if she tilted it right, initials that weren't her father's. CC were his. These read, faint but legible once she found the angle. RM. Not her father's watch then. Someone else's. Kept, for reasons she didn't yet understand, safe alongside everything else he'd meant for her to find. She set it down carefully, aware suddenly of how many small threads were pulling loose around her. Earl's flicker of withheld grief, Marlene's cold persistence, a stranger's initials on a stopped watch, and how each one seemed to lead not away from her father, but deeper into a version of him she was only beginning to meet. Tomorrow, she thought, she'd ask Earl about RM. She had a feeling, sitting there in the lamplit dark with the barn settling and creaking around her like something slowly waking up, that this particular thread might matter more than the others. Earl didn't answer right away when Wren set the watch on the table between them, initials turned up toward the light. RM, she said. You know who that is. Earl picked up the watch with the particular care of a man handling something that had once mattered to someone he'd loved. He turned it over twice before he set it back down. Ruth Mercer, he said finally. She ran the diner in town for near on 20 years. The one that closed up 2 winters back. You might have seen the building, boarded windows on Main. Ruth was the one who got your daddy into meetings. AA, I mean. She'd lost a husband to drink herself, years before, and she had a way of finding folks who were circling the same drain and pulling them out before it swallowed them whole. He smiled, small and sad. She pulled your daddy out. Took the better part of 2 years, but she did it. Were they together? Eventually, yes. Took even longer for him to let himself have that, feeling the way he did about everything he'd already broken. But the last 4 years of his life, Ruth Mercer was about the only real happiness the man let himself keep. Earl's voice had gone rough at the edges. She passed 18 months before he did. Heart, same as him, funny enough. He never did stop wearing that watch after hers, from her own late husband, if you can believe the layers on that story. Wore it every day till the day he died, and I expect he wanted you to have it, because it was, near as I can tell, the truest thing he owned by the end. Proof a broken man could still be loved right, if he let himself. Wren sat with that for a long moment, turning the stopped watch over in her fingers, feeling the weight of a whole hidden chapter of her father's life settling into place. Not just grief and shame and slow repair, but love too, real and late, and apparently enough to matter. "Why didn't you tell me all this the first day?" she asked, not accusing, just tired, wanting to understand the shape of what he'd been protecting. Because grief like his isn't a thing you can hand somebody all at once, Earl said. You'd have drowned in it. "I gave you what you could carry, when you could carry it. Same as your daddy tried to do with that letter and that lockbox, piece by piece, instead of all in one blow." He nudged the watch back toward her. "You're carrying it well, for what it's worth. Better than he ever gave himself credit for doing." She left Earl's that afternoon with something loosening in her chest that had been clenched tight since the lawyer's letter first arrived. Not resolution, not yet, but something like permission to keep going. The work on the barn had, by then, taken on its own rhythm. Dwayne came by most days after his own jobs wrapped, sometimes bringing his nephew Cody, a lanky 19-year-old who talked too much and measured everything wrong the first time, but who worked hard and made Wren laugh in a way she hadn't in longer than she could easily place. Between the three of them, the barn's bones were slowly reasserting themselves, new roof sections closing the gaps overhead, rotted stalls torn out and rebuilt square, the old grain elevator itself cleaned and reinforced rather than torn down, because Wren found, once the dust settled, that she didn't want to erase the place where she'd found her father's letter. She wanted to keep it standing. It was Cody, of all people, who brought her the next thread without meaning to. "My grandma used to talk about this place," he said one afternoon, straddling a sawhorse while he sorted nails by size, mostly incorrectly. "Said there was some kind of trouble out here, way back, before your daddy even owned it. Something about a fire." "A fire?" "Yeah, like the barn that was here before this one. Burned down sometime way back. I don't know, maybe the 70s? Grandma said the family that owned it before lost near everything." "That's how your daddy got it so cheap, way back when. Land nobody wanted 'cause of what happened." Dwayne, overhearing, shot his nephew a look that suggested this wasn't information meant for casual sharing, but the seed was already planted, and Wren found she couldn't let it go. That evening, she pulled the journal back out and searched more carefully through its early pages, the ones she'd skimmed past before, in favor of the more recent entries. Near the very front, dated the year Colton had first bought the land, she found it. "Talked to the old fellow who sold me the place today, name of Whitfield. Told me there'd been a fire out here decades back, before his time even. Took the original barn and near took a life besides. Said folks around here still call it unlucky land, on account of it. I told him I didn't put much stock in luck, good or bad, just hard work. We'll see if I still believe that a year from now." Not the discovery she'd been braced for, but it explained something. The layer of superstition she'd felt brushing against her more than once in town, the way certain older folks looked at her a beat too long when they learned where she was living. Not just pity for a struggling young woman. Something older than that. Half forgotten but not fully gone. She thought about asking Earl, decided instead to let it sit, gather more of its shape, before she went looking for the rest. The real gift of that week, though, came quieter than any reveal. It was a Thursday evening, the sky doing its long golden thing over the newly repaired roofline, When Dwayne straightened up from the stall he'd been framing, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked around the barn. Really looked, the way a person does when they're taking stock of distance traveled. "You know," he said, "3 weeks ago, this place looked like it was fixing to fall down around your ears. Look at it now." Wren looked. The roof was whole. The stalls stood square. Light came through the windows clean, instead of through broken gaps. And the old grain elevator stood reinforced and sturdy at the back, holding its secrets a little more gently now that most of them had been let out into the light. "I didn't do this alone," she said. "No," Dwayne agreed. "You didn't. But you're the one who decided it was worth doing. That's the part that matters most, far as I can tell." Standing there in the barn, her father had spent the last years of his broken, mending life, quietly rebuilding. Wren felt something settle into place that she hadn't fully expected to feel this soon. Not just grief, transforming slowly into understanding, but something that might, if she let it, grow into pride. She still had questions. The fire, Marlene Ashby's cold persistence, which hadn't fully gone quiet. The particular weight of what unlucky land might still mean for a woman rebuilding it alone. But for the first time since she'd signed those papers in Otis Bramwell's office with $340 and nowhere else to go, Wren Calloway stood in her father's barn and felt, unmistakably, like she was building something that might actually last. The storm came without much warning, the way November storms sometimes did, a front that had been forecast as a chance of rain turning, over the course of one long afternoon, into something with teeth. Wren was up in the loft when the wind first started worrying at the new roof sections. A low, insistent pressure she felt more than heard at first, like the barn itself had started holding its breath. By the time she climbed down to check the forecast on her phone, the sky outside had gone the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind had picked up enough to send loose lumber scraps skittering across the yard. "Severe thunderstorm warning," she read aloud to no one, and then, a beat later, watching a gust bend the tree line at the property's edge nearly sideways, "Tornado watch." She'd lived in cities most her life, in apartments with sturdy neighbors on every side, and buildings that didn't much care what the sky was doing. She had no real instinct for this. For a barn alone on 40 acres with a roof 3 weeks finished and stalls still smelling of fresh-cut lumber, all of it suddenly feeling less like shelter and more like a structure daring the weather to test it. She called Dwayne. No answer. His own place, she'd learn later, was already losing power, tree branches down across his driveway. She called Earl next, and he picked up on the second ring, voice tight with the same weather worry she was feeling. "Get to the house if you can," he said. "Storm cellar under it. My daddy dug it back in the 50s. You come here. You hear me? Don't sit that out in the barn." But by the time she'd gathered what she could carry, the lockbox, the journal, the photograph of herself at 5 years old, the wind outside had turned genuinely dangerous, debris moving horizontal across the yard, and she made the call, right or wrong, that the 2-minute drive to Earl's was a worse risk than riding it out where she was. She sheltered in the old grain elevator itself, oddly enough, its reinforced walls, freshly rebuilt, the sturdiest structure on the property now, stronger even than the farmhouse foundation long since torn down. She sat on the floor where she'd once found her father's letter, knees pulled to her chest, and listened to the storm take the barn apart around her one violent gust at a time. The roof went first, not all of it, but a section over the northeast corner, the same corner Dwayne and Cody had patched together in their very first day of work, torn free with a shriek of metal that Wren felt in her teeth. Rain came pouring through in sheets after that, and somewhere in the dark she heard something heavier give way. A support beam, she'd learn later, one of the old ones she hadn't gotten around to reinforcing yet, buckling under water weight and wind pressure both. She did not cry, though she came close. She sat with her back against the grain elevator's reinforced wall, soaked through, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, of her father sitting in this exact structure some years back, alone, rebuilding a life from wreckage far more total than a storm. "This place rewards stubborn," he'd written. She stayed stubborn until the wind finally, gradually, began to ease. Morning showed her the damage in full, and it was worse than she'd let herself imagine in the dark. The northeast roof section was gone entirely, open sky where new tin had stood the day before. The support beam had brought part of the loft down with it, a tangle of splintered wood across what had been, 12 hours earlier, one of the barn's soundest corners. Water stood ankle-deep in 2 of the newly rebuilt stalls. Weeks of work, undone in a single night. Dwayne arrived not long after sunrise, his own place still without power, and he stood in the barn's ruined corner, with his jaw set tight, saying nothing for a long moment. "I'm sorry," Wren said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. The damage wasn't her fault, but something in her still felt the need to say it, the old instinct of a person used to bracing for disappointment before it landed. "Don't you dare," Dwayne said, sharper than she'd heard him yet. "This isn't a thing you did wrong. Storm like that, it'd have taken down structures twice as sound as what we'd built here." He surveyed the wreckage another long moment, then rolled his shoulders back, the gesture of a man settling into a problem instead of letting it settle onto him. "We rebuild it, same as before. Just means we're not done yet." But rebuilding took money Wren mostly didn't have. The lockbox's cash had already gone further than she'd expected, into materials and permits, and the slow bleed of daily costs, and a new roof section, done right this time with sturdier trusses, would eat most of what remained. It was Sherry Voss, of all people, who delivered the next blow. Not out of cruelty this time, just business, when Wren went to the hardware store to price the materials. "Prices went up on lumber last week," Sherry said, not quite meeting her eyes, sliding a printed quote across the counter. "Supply issue, nothing I can help." "You're looking at about 40% more than you would have paid a month back." Wren did the math in the truck afterward, sitting in the hardware store parking lot with the quote in her lap, and understood, with a cold, sinking clarity, that what remained in the lockbox wasn't going to cover it. Not close. She thought briefly of Marlene Ashby's casserole and her too smooth offer, still sitting somewhere in the back of her mind like a held breath. More than fair price, you wouldn't have to lift another finger, and hated herself a little for how tempting it suddenly was to consider giving up. She didn't call Marlene. But she sat in that parking lot a long time before she found the will to drive back to the barn, and when she did finally turn the key, it wasn't stubbornness pushing her so much as something closer to fear. The fear that she'd come 2 months and one whole grief further into understanding her father, only to lose the last thing he'd left her because the sky had decided, on one random Tuesday, to take it back. Back at the barn, surveying the wreckage in the fuller light of afternoon, she noticed something she'd missed in the storm's aftermath the first time. A section of the old loft flooring, torn loose by the falling beam, revealing a gap beneath it that hadn't been visible before. Something metal glinted faintly in the space beneath the broken boards. She stood there a long moment, torn between exhaustion and a curiosity she couldn't quite suppress, water still dripping somewhere behind her from the broken roof. Whatever was under that floor, it hadn't been part of the lockbox, hadn't been part of anything Earl or the letter had prepared her for. It would have to wait until morning. She was too tired, too soaked through with rain and worry to face one more unanswered thing tonight. But she marked the spot in her mind before she left. One more thread pulling loose in a place that seemed determined to keep surprising her, for better or worse, right when she least expected room in her chest for anything more. Morning brought no easy answers, only more rain, a slow grey drizzle that soaked into everything and made the ruined corner of the barn look even more like defeat than it had the day before. Wren returned to the loose floorboard first thing, unable to let it sit any longer despite her exhaustion. Working the broken planks free by hand, she found not another lockbox, not another letter, but something stranger. A small rusted tin, the kind that might once have held tobacco or hard candy, wedged into a gap between joists like someone had hidden it there in a hurry, or hidden it so well they'd meant it to stay hidden for good. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone stiff with age, was a stack of old photographs, black and white, edges curling, and a folded newspaper clipping so brittle it nearly crumbled in her hands. She smoothed it open carefully on the loft floor. Barn fire claims outbuilding. Family unharmed. The headline read, dated some 40 years back. The article was short, local paper terse, naming the family who'd owned the land before her father, the Whitfields, and noting, almost as an afterthought, that the fire's cause remained undetermined, though faulty wiring was suspected. One photograph, when she turned it over, had names penciled on the back: a man, a woman, and a young boy standing in front of a barn that, judging by its condition, predated even the fire. Harold and Ruth Whitfield, and son Daniel, 1961. Ruth Whitfield. Not the same Ruth as Earl's Ruth Mercer. A different Ruth entirely. A coincidence of names that meant nothing, probably, except to remind Wren how many women's lives had quietly shaped this land before her own. She didn't have time to sit with the discovery the way she wanted to. The rain was worsening, and Dwayne's truck pulled up not long after, Cody riding shotgun, both of them already talking through repair logistics before they'd even reached the barn door. "Materials are the problem," Dwayne said, once they'd surveyed the damage together again in daylight. "Even at the old price, we were cutting it close. At 40% up." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "I don't have it," Wren said plainly, tired past the point of softening it. "Not all of it. Maybe not even half." The three of them stood in the rain-damp ruin of the northeast corner a long moment, none of them speaking, until Cody, of all people, broke the silence. "What if we didn't buy new lumber for all of it?" he said. "There's a barn coming down out past Route 9, the old Kessler place. They're demoing it next week, 'cause the county's putting in that new road extension. Beams on that thing are probably as old as this land. Might could salvage what we need, if we asked." Dwayne considered this, something shifting in his face. "That's not a bad thought, actually. Won't match perfect, but sounds sound. And salvage is free, if you're willing to do the labor of pulling it yourself." It became, over the following days, a strange kind of community effort. Dwayne calling in favors, Cody recruiting 2 friends from his old high school crew, even Earl showing up on the second day with his ancient flatbed trailer and a thermos of coffee, ready to haul salvaged lumber back to the barn. Word had apparently traveled through town in the particular quiet way small towns carried news, because by the 3rd day of the Kessler barn demolition, there were faces Wren didn't fully recognize helping load beams, people who'd known her father, it turned out, in ways large and small, offering their labor now the way they perhaps wished they'd offered him something, years back, before it was too late. Even Sherry Voss appeared on the 4th day, in work gloves and an old flannel that had clearly seen barn duty before, saying nothing about the lumber prices or the comment she'd made weeks earlier, just working alongside the others, in a silence that felt, Wren thought, like its own kind of apology. "Didn't expect this," Wren admitted to Earl, watching the loose crowd of neighbors hauling beams toward the truck. "Small towns," Earl said. "We're slow to trust and slower to say sorry outright. But we show up. That's usually how it gets said instead." He glanced toward her, something gentler in his weathered face. "Your daddy would have been out here helping some other family in the exact same spot, if the shoe were on the other foot. I expect that's not lost on some of these folks." It wasn't enough in the end to fully solve the money problem. The salvaged lumber closed most of the gap, but there were still supplies that had to be bought new, permits and fasteners, and the reinforced trusses no amount of scavenging could replace. Wren sat with the math late one night, the lockbox's dwindling cash spread across the kitchen table she'd salvaged and refinished herself, and understood, with a tightness in her chest she hadn't felt since the week of her mother's diagnosis, that even with the town's help, she might come up short. It was in that low moment, staring at numbers that refused to add up no matter how she arranged them, that she thought again, unwillingly, guiltily, of Marlene Ashby's offer. More than fair price. You wouldn't have to lift another finger. For one long, exhausted hour, sitting alone at that table, with rain still tapping intermittently at the windows, Wren let herself imagine it. The relief of simply stopping, selling, taking whatever Dale Ashby's company offered, paying off what little debt remained, starting over somewhere easier, somewhere that didn't demand this much of her just to keep standing. She thought about the letter. This place rewards stubborn. She thought about the photograph of the Whitfield family, a barn that had already survived one disaster, only to eventually pass to a man who'd rebuilt his own life alongside it, board by board, year by year, alone. She thought about Dwayne's steady hands, and Cody's earnest, over-talkative help, and Earl's flatbed trailer, and even Sherry Voss showing up in work gloves without a word of apology needed, because the work itself had said it for her. She didn't call Marlene Ashby. Instead, near midnight, she pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her and began, slowly, to write a letter of her own, not to send anywhere, not yet, maybe not ever, but because she found she needed, suddenly and urgently, to put into words the things she hadn't been able to say out loud to anyone, including herself, since the storm had torn the roof away and left her standing in the wreckage wondering if she had it in her to keep going. "Dad," she began, and then sat a long while before she found the next words. The tin of old photographs and the newspaper clipping still spread beside her on the table. One more piece of a story she was only just beginning to fully understand. She didn't finish the letter that night. She fell asleep instead at the kitchen table, head resting on her folded arms, and woke before dawn to the sound of her own phone buzzing, Earl, calling earlier than he ever had. "You need to come by," he said, and something in his voice, tight and careful, told her this wasn't about lumber or storms. "Found something I should have given you sooner. Wasn't sure how, till now." She drove over still half-dressed for sleep, the sky just beginning to grey at the edges. Earl met her at the door with a shoebox instead of a coffee mug and set it on the table between them the way he'd set the watch down, weeks before, carefully, like it might still hurt someone if handled wrong. "Ruth kept this," he said. "Gave it to me for safekeeping before she passed. Said I'd know when the time was right to pass it on. I didn't, not really, until you mentioned that newspaper clipping yesterday, the Whitfield fire. Thing is," he paused, rubbing a hand over his jaw, "Ruth Mercer's maiden name was Whitfield. She was Daniel Whitfield's little sister, grew up on this exact land, in the barn that burned." Wren sat very still. The Ruth in the photograph, Harold and Ruth Whitfield. Her mother. Yes. Earl nodded slowly. Small world gets smaller out here than you'd think. Ruth never talked much about the fire. Lost her older brother in it, actually, this Daniel you found pictured. She was young, maybe 6 or 7 at the time. Whole reason she ended up devoting so much of her life afterward to helping folks who were drowning in something. I always figured she'd lost someone to something nobody could quite name or fix in time. Fire that night, best anyone ever pieced together, started from Daniel trying to keep a lantern lit against the cold, showing off some, the way boys do. Family never fully recovered from it, sold the land eventually, moved off, and Ruth didn't come back to this county for decades, not till she was a grown woman needing a fresh start herself. And she ended up back here, on the same land, basically just up the road. Called it fate herself, more than once. Said this land had a way of asking people to face down whatever they were most afraid of, one way or another. She believed that fierce. Told your daddy the exact same thing early on when he was still deep in his drinking and swore this place was cursed, unlucky. Same word old Whitfield used to describe it to him at the sale. Ruth told him the land wasn't unlucky. Said it just didn't let anybody hide from themselves for very long. Called it a mercy, not a curse. Wren opened the shoebox. Inside were more photographs. A few letters between Ruth and people whose names meant nothing to her yet. And, near the bottom, a small hand-drawn map, a child's rendering, by the wobbly lines of it, of the property as it had once been, the old barn marked with a careful X, and, beside it, in a different, adult hand added later, a note, for whoever comes after. This land held us up when nothing else could. May it do the same for you. She wrote that after your daddy passed, Earl said quietly. Knew, I think, that his kin would eventually come looking, one way or another. Wanted to leave something of her own, alongside whatever he left you. Never got the chance to say it to your face herself. Wren sat with the map a long while, feeling the strange, expanding shape of the story settling into something larger than she'd first understood it to be. Not just her father's private redemption, but a longer thread running through this land, generation after generation, of people finding their way back from ruin because the ground itself, somehow, refused to let them stay lost. Why didn't he ever remarry? Wren asked suddenly, a different question rising up unbidden. After Ruth, he had 4 more years. Earl was quiet a long moment. I asked him that once, near the end. He said Ruth taught him the one thing he'd never learned before, how to actually stay. Instead of running, the second things got hard. Said he figured the best way to honor that lesson was spending what time he had left proving it, not to another person, but to this land, and to you, even not knowing if you'd ever come collect on it. Earl's voice caught, just slightly. He believed you would, though. Near the end, he told me that plain. Said you had your mother's caution, but his own stubbornness underneath it. And stubbornness, given enough time, tends to win out. Driving back to the barn that morning, the shoebox on the seat beside her, where the lockbox and the key had once sat, Wren found herself thinking less about the money problem still waiting to be solved, and more about the strange, layered inheritance she'd actually been given. Not just land and cash and a stopped watch, but an entire hidden lineage of people who'd faced this same ground's demand to stop hiding, and had, each in their own hard way, answered it. She thought of Marlene Ashby's smooth, patient offer, and understood now, with a clarity that felt like the last piece of something clicking into place, exactly why she'd never call. This land didn't just belong to her. It had been quietly holding people up, asking them to become who they needed to be, for longer than she'd been alive to notice. And whatever came next, storm damage and money troubles included, she wasn't going to be the one who let it fall into hands that saw it as nothing more than lots to subdivide and sell. She was going to finish what her father started, whatever that took. The wiring should have been the easiest part. Wren had put off doing it herself, deferring instead to a licensed electrician Dwayne recommended, a wiry, no-nonsense woman named Pat, who'd wired half the barns in the county, and clearly took pride in doing it right. But money being what it was, thinner now than it had been even after the salvage lumber closed most of the storm's gap, Wren had made the call to handle the simpler runs herself, following Pat's instructions to the letter, saving what little remained for the trickier work near the loft. It was 2 nights after Pat finished the main panel, with Wren alone in the barn late, double-checking a junction box by lamplight, that she caught the smell, faint at first, easy to dismiss, a warm, acrid note under the usual scent of sawdust and rain-damp wood. She found the source in the wall behind the old grain elevator, smoke curling thin and grey from a gap where new wiring ran too close to old, dry timber Pat had flagged for replacement, but that Wren, cutting corners on cost, had told herself could wait. It caught fast once it caught at all, the way old Barnwood always did, the way, she understood suddenly and with a cold, sick lurch, it must have caught for the Whitfield family more than 40 years before. A boy showing off with a lantern, faulty wiring, whatever the true cause had actually been. The land's old wound reopening almost exactly where the first one had happened. She didn't freeze. That surprised her later, thinking back on it. How the months of hard, patient work, the calluses, and the stubborn insistence on learning each repair properly instead of shortcutting it, seemed to click into place all at once. Muscle memory, doing what panic might otherwise have undone. She killed the power at the main panel first, plunging the barn into near total dark, then grabbed the fire extinguisher Pat had insisted she buy and mount by the door, an insistence Wren had privately thought excessive, 3 weeks back, and now blessed with her whole shaking body. She fought the flame at its base, low and controlled, the way a safety pamphlet she'd half-skimmed once had described, and for one terrible stretch of seconds thought she'd lost the fight entirely as the fire found a dry seam of old timber and leapt higher. Then, as suddenly as it had flared, it guttered, choked back by the extinguisher's last reserves and the wet rag she'd thought to grab and press against the licking edge nearest the grain elevator's reinforced wall, the same wall, she'd realize only later, that held her father's hidden compartment, the letter's resting place, still smelling faintly of smoke, but structurally, mercifully, intact. She sat down hard on the dirt floor once it was fully out, hands black with soot and shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone to call Dwayne. He arrived within 15 minutes, Cody not far behind, both of them finding her still sitting there in the dark, staring at the scorched wall, with an expression somewhere between shock and something that might, given time, become pride. "You put that out yourself," Dwayne said, not quite a question, taking in the extinguisher's empty canister, the wet rag, the contained scope of the damage. "I didn't know if I could," Wren admitted. "But you did." He crouched down beside her, uncharacteristically gentle. "That's not luck, Wren. That's months of learning this place inside and out, finally paying off when it mattered most." The damage, once they'd assessed it fully by morning light, was contained but real. A section of wall scorched black, some wiring to redo properly this time, no shortcuts, Pat's professional hand the whole way through. Small, in the scheme of the storm's earlier destruction. Survivable. In a way, the original Whitfield fire, with its lost boy and its family that never fully recovered, apparently hadn't been. Earl came by that afternoon, took in the scorch marks with a long, unreadable look, and said only, "Land already tried to burn once. This same spot near enough. You stopped it same as your daddy would have, best of his ability." That's worth sitting with a while. Wren did sit with it, sat with the strange, humbling weight of having faced down, in miniature, the exact disaster that had once broken an entire family on this land, and having come through it, not because someone rescued her, but because she'd spent months becoming the kind of person capable of putting it out herself. That evening, cleaning soot from her hands under the rain barrel's cold trickle, the same ritual she'd performed after that first long day with Dwayne, she found herself finally finishing the letter she'd started weeks before at the kitchen table. "Dad," she wrote, "I used to think you left me nothing but questions. I understand now you left me exactly what I needed instead, a place that would ask everything of me, and enough of your own hard-won stubbornness in my blood to actually answer. I put out a fire tonight, in the same spot yours started rebuilding, maybe in the same spot Ruth's family lost everything, years before either of us. I didn't run. I didn't call anyone to save me until it was already handled. I think that's the version of me you were hoping might come collect on all this. I think I might finally be becoming her." She folded the letter and tucked it, unsent, but no less real for that, into the same journal where his own words had first found her. "Spring came to the barn the way it comes to land. that's finally been given permission to heal. Slowly, then all at once, green pushing up through the mud along the tree line. The scorched wall behind the grain elevator, sanded smooth and refinished, until only someone who knew to look could still find the faint, darker grain where the fire had touched it. Wren kept that mark. She'd thought about covering it entirely, at first, erasing the scare of that night along with the physical evidence. But Dwayne had talked her out of it, gently, the way he talked her through most things by then. "Some things are worth being able to see," he'd said. "Remind you what you're capable of, next time something tries to take you down." The barn stood whole by then, roof sound clear across, stalls rebuilt square, and this time reinforced properly against whatever weather came next. The old grain elevator repaired and repurposed, half storage, half something Wren hadn't fully named yet, but had started, privately, to think of as a kind of shrine. Not somber, just honest, a place that held what it needed to hold. She'd used the last of the lockbox's money, in the end, not on more repairs, but on something her father's letter had planted, without either of them fully realizing it at the time. A small flock of chickens. A half-acre garden turned and planted her first real spring on the land. The beginning, however modest, of the working property her father had once dreamed this place might become again. Marlene Ashby stopped by once more, early that spring, her offer, this time noticeably smaller, her patience thinner. Wren declined again, without rancor, and watched something in Marlene's face finally, grudgingly, accept the answer as final. She never came back after that. Sherry Voss, by contrast, became something like a friend, dropped by more than once with extra seedlings from her own garden, no longer commenting on staying power, having apparently seen enough of it firsthand to stop doubting. And on a bright morning in late April, nearly 6 months to the day since she'd first stood in the barn's doorway, with $340 and nowhere else to go, Wren found herself on the receiving end of an unexpected knock. A girl, maybe 19, standing awkward and uncertain at the property's edge, a duffel bag over one shoulder, and an old, creased newspaper clipping in her hand about a young woman who'd rebuilt an inherited barn from nothing. "I saw the article about you," the girl said. "The one in the county paper. I aged out of foster care back in the winter, and I don't have anywhere, really. And I heard you might need help sometimes, and I thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Wren recognized the shape of it too well. The particular mix of pride and desperation in someone who'd learned not to ask for things directly, because asking, too often, had cost more than it gave back. "What's your name?" Wren asked. "Delia." "Well, Delia." Wren stepped back from the door. An invitation, the same gesture Earl had once offered her on a cold November morning that felt, now, like a different lifetime. "Come on in. Coffee's fresh. I could use the help, if you're willing to work for it." She watched something loosen in the girl's shoulders. The same loosening, she understood now, that she must have shown herself, once, standing in Earl's kitchen with a father's key in her pocket, and no idea yet what she was going to do with the strange, heavy gift she'd been handed. That evening, after Delia had gone quiet and thoughtful over her first real meal in what looked like some time, Wren sat alone for a while on the barn's front step, watching the light go long and gold across land that had asked everything of her and given back, in the end, more than she'd known to hope for. She thought about her father, writing his letter alone in this same barn, believing more than he let himself admit that someone would eventually come to collect what he'd built. She thought about Ruth Whitfield Mercer, and the boy lost to a lantern's careless flame, and the strange mercy of land that refused to let anyone hide from themselves for long. She thought about Earl, and Dwayne, and even Sherry Voss with her seedlings, and the whole quiet architecture of a community that showed up, in its own imperfect way, when it mattered most. The truest inheritance, she understood now, sitting there with the evening settling soft and golden around her, had never really been the money in that lockbox. It was this, the barn standing whole behind her, a stranger's daughter finding her own uncertain footing inside it, and the quiet, hard-won certainty that whatever came next, she wasn't starting from nothing anymore. She was building something that would outlast her, the same as her father had, the same as Ruth before him, each of them passing the work forward, hand to hand, to whoever came next with nowhere else to go. If you've ever had to start over with next to nothing, if you're in the middle of that kind of rebuilding right now, I hope Wren's story reminds you what Earl told her that very first cold morning. This kind of land, this kind of life, rewards stubborn. Thanks for staying with this one all the way to the end. If it moved you, I'd love to hear which part hit hardest in the comments. And if you want more stories like it, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one waiting next week.